just to thank you very much, Lindsay, for the warm welcome. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Loveday. And indeed, thank you very much, Engage, because for as long as I have been professionally working in this field, Engage has been one of my lifelines between the annual conference, the various interim networking meetings, Engage summer schools, the opportunity to both read about practice and contribute to practice through the journals have all been incredibly important to me. And for those of you who don't know me, my life and career has been firmly situated in the public domain in terms of arts practice. I trained as a visual artist and worked as a socially engaged arts practitioner for 10 years before joining the Irish Museum of Modern Art in 1991. And as a professional educator working in what is relatively a small country relative to the UK and others, it has been really important from early on in my career that I engaged with international dialogue. And that I've done through many European funded learning programs, and I see a lot of very familiar faces here of people whom I shared lovely times with on some of those programs. And then more recently, I started to look at the USA and where I could find commonality and people that I could also share practice with. And that can lead me to my Fulbright and my story today. So sorry, just great. I suppose international dialogue can be interinstitutional, but I think it's also about personal synchronicity and like-mindedness. And I first met Wendy Woon, who is was the Edward John Noble Foundation Deputy Director for Education at MoMA in 1998, and she introduced us through a person in common, the late Judith Mastai, at the time was working as Director of Education in the Art Gallery of Ontario. And Wendy, who is Canadian by birth, was working in the Art Institute in Chicago. So she and I both presented our work at a Canadian conference. And I think we immediately saw that we had a lot in common, in particular in relation to our principles of practice. So we kept in touch with each other, and then as the years developed, we started to look at practice. When she moved in 2006 to MoMA, we started to look at sharing practice. So she was very interested in and sent staff to IMA to observe our programme for older people. And then in turn, in the late round about 2010, we started to look back at what they were doing in relation to the Meet Me at MoMA programme, which was a very ambitious research project looking at how people living with dementia and their carers could continue to be regular visitors and participants in education programs and museums. That work has led to us having a national programme in Ireland, which IMA has developed with a number of partners and with up to 13 or 14 galleries and museums around the country. And then more recently in 2018, Joanne Lefrak, who has a very exciting practice in Santa Fe in New Mexico, invited me alongside Wendy and as one of 3 international participants in a programme that she had been developing as part of the Site Santa Fe Biennale, which had been developed from 2012, whereby as part of that Biennale, there was a convening or a retreat of art education directors, as they are called in the US, and give people an opportunity to come together to share practice. So in 2018, I joined 12 others, including Cara Courage from Tate and a representative from the Melbourne Museum of Modern Art, And Wendy and I then started to talk about my ambition to apply for a Fulbright Scholarship. And during that year, 2018, I started to do a number of site visits to see what was happening in MoMA, and I gradually shaped a proposal. I've always been really interested in the early 1920s, 30s, and this seminal thinking around art education and progressive development education. People that I've been reading and have met and interested in was Carol Duncan, feminist art historians' analysis of art institutions. And then obviously, like so many people in gallery education, an informant for my practice was John Dewey, and then more recently George Hine, and then the groundbreaking work of Project Zero. So there was a number of of American influences that I thought, why not go and try and spend more time in that culture that has seeped into the arts and education kind of dialogues here in Ireland. So I put my proposal into a Fulbright, and it was fantastic. It was accepted. And one of the reasons also why this was really important for me, not just personally, professionally, but also because it was a pivotal moment in NIMA where I work. We have been approved by government to develop a collections and learning centre, and we're developing thinking around that. It may be a new building that is built on site, but essentially, whether it's a new building or a repurposing of one of the older buildings on site, what we want to do is look at how the 30-year history of IMA's own archives and practice, linking it with global practice, could become a space where globally where researchers be interested in coming to. So my application to the Fulbright was to immerse myself between the archives in MoMA and the education department in order to look at what they were doing there. What was of interest was that in 2012, the Museum of Modern Art had the seminal archives from the first 30 years returned to them. They hadn't had them in their holdings, but they were returned in 2012. And once they went through the archivists and conservation, the education department started to work with them. And Wendy commissioned Dr. Sarah Torres to look at those first 30 years and look at the founding principles of practice, which were developed by the founding director of education, Victor D'Amico. So his papers formed a way through which the MoMA education team could consider reflecting on the past in order to plan the future. And I think this is where I found this really interesting, how archives don't become fossilized in an archive somewhere. They can become a living way of reflecting back in order to move forward, which is something that I have done in my practice on many occasions. So this was also really helpful for me to consider and imagine what would it be like in 30 years hence or 80 years hence in IMA if we had our archives available to the public. So the period in MoMA facilitated me to work with colleagues and professionals. I split my time between the archives in the mornings, and I shadowed one of their live programs in the afternoons. At that point in MoMA, after a number of trial projects, Wendy really wanted to visually and physically place the education program much more to the centre of what was happening in the museum. On the slide here, on the right-hand side, I'm looking across the courtyard in MoMA, where they have a dedicated building to education and archives, and with, fully serviced, beautifully designed lecture rooms and studio spaces. But it is cut off quite notably from the main track of the museum. And when they were extending the museum to put a bid in and managed to get what you see in the left-hand slide, a very, very primal space just between 53rd and 54th Street, where she placed the People Studio, a project that she had been exploring for a number of years prior to this as a kind of temporary pop-up experience. She worked very closely with her team to look at those founding principles that D'Amico had drawn together in relation to designing what would happen in this creative lab. So I'm just going to flip through for a few slides so you can kind of get a sense of it. So this was a lab that was set up for adults and teenagers. It was fully facilitated with an education team who designed a number of ways into exploring and talking about artworks. They took themes from the collection shows that were on view, and they in turn invited people through prompts to make responses to those artworks. It was very much premised on exploring process rather than art making. And it was also a space that facilitated a huge range of conversations. It also was a space where a number of artists were commissioned to in turn go deeper into ways of thinking about art making. It was very much socially engaged and about premised on art of the everyday rather than a hierarchical canonizing of the great masters that also populated their collection. I spent time with the Victor D'Amico papers, and that was a really interesting thing for me as a professional, because as I read his papers and incredible, diligently recorded they were, I started to feel that this resonated so much with my pioneering years at the Irish Museum of Modern Art in the early 1990s. I could relate to the sense of breaking new ground and opening up new avenues for creating access to the arts, and also to the importance that these records are safely kept in the public domain and their value given parity in institutions' records alongside the archives that relate to artworks and collections. The period that D'Amico was working in was one of great change and development in art education, pedagogy, psychology, with many Europeans migrating to the USA after World War II. And this resulted in a melting pot of innovation where cross-disciplinary work and cross-fertilization of ideas were fermented. The education team at MoMA had a look back at a lot of the seminal thinkers of that time, and they developed a training program for the artists, educators who were going to facilitate this space. So they looked back at Nell and Jenny Lloyd-Jones of Hillside Homeschool, Annie and Joseph Albers of the Black Mountain College, Buckminster Fuller, John Dewey, Victor Lowenfeld, Jane Addams, and Ellen Gates Starr. All of these people and more there was records of meetings that they had with Victor D'Amico during the period of the first 30 years of his period of time. And one of the legacies that he created was this idea of a creativity lab, also thinking about a lab and research. And so Wendy took that as a concept. And if I can quote her here, she described the People's Studio as a participatory program organized around the theme collective imagination. It focuses on the human relationships that shape works of art. Visitors can learn about and experiment with artist strategies that rely on exchange, shared reflection, and collaboration. So each week there was visitors were invited through, once they had a ticket into the museum, they could drop into the lab at any time. They could spend a couple of minutes or they could spend days. And indeed, I saw evidence of both of that happening. The program was, the environment was really carefully thought through in terms of what it felt like when you walked into it. To quote Wendy, she said, it's not a kiddie lab. It is about respecting a space for older, young teens, older teens, and adults could feel comfortable in. She designed a whole lot of interactions into the space. So what we see here on the slide is the work of a collective based in Brooklyn called Wendy Subway. No relation to Wendy Woon, the director, just a coincidence. So these are books and artist books made collaboratively about arts practice. She also then there was a program where if you wanted to dig deeper into any of what seemed like sort of first short prompts, you could dig deep into a number of sequential workshops that brought people into a deeper understanding of the processes that artists go through when they're making art. And she also then had a series of really exciting longer-term projects, and the one that she wanted me to draw attention to today is the one here with Kemi Rosido Sijo, where this artist worked with the security teams in MoMA and unearthed their artist practice, and that work is available on YouTube channels related to the MoMA. So what she wanted to do was break down those sort of old hierarchical notions about who has the right to make art, when they make art, where they make art. But also she wanted to really emphasize that there is a process, that artists work through a process, and it's not always about the product that people make in order to actually realize that process. So in preparing for the programme, the education team, as I said, examined the pedagogical and artistic practices of the range of influential practitioners and key thinkers throughout history that have an association directly at MoMA or who are influencers in the broader fields of arts, education and pedagogy. And they documented the programmes rigorously with exit evaluations, with surveys, with focus groups, and they drew all of that together because through their in-house evaluator who worked full-time in the education department at MoMA. And the focus was very much on facilitating, as I said, adults and teens who are self-directed visitors in the museum and generally would be accounted for as part of the broader public with a high proportion of tourists and once-off visitors attending. This project very much addressed what the founding director of education in MoMA had said, which was about museums not always creating works of art, but rather experiments. And as he said, it was not our intention to fill museums, we're gathering experience. And Wendy talked about that in one of her written manifestations that when she was presenting at one of the events that I attended when I was in New York, where she said, we often try to imagine what it was like for MoMA's first director of education, Victor D'Amico, to build a new, expansive education programme dedicated to art with a radically different modern aesthetic at a time when the public was hard hit by the Great Depression. Having studied at Columbia's University Teaching College, D'Amico was steeped in the educational and aesthetic theories of John Dewey, for whom experience was central. Dewey challenged the aesthetic hierarchies and institutions that isolated art and championed the connection of art to everyday life. This was a wonderful opportunity for me to spend 3 months embedded in an education department in another institution where I had so much shared values of, particularly with the team there. It gave me a time to step out of the everyday of my own work and to read, those books that you pile up on your shelf and don't get a chance to read. So one of my guiding books this time was Emily Pringle's more recent publication on rethinking research in the Art Museum. And like that book and like what she has analysed in relation to being a researcher, this very much facilitated me to be an embedded and an embodied researcher, gave me time to reflect on practice historically, to reflect on my own practice, and with the generosity of the team in MoMA to reflect on their practice. So the returning to before I complete my presentation, just to reflect a little bit on some of my key learnings, and I know Lindsay's going to draw me out on some others. Returning from MoMA, besides the fact that I was re-energized to have that can-do American zump in my blood, I was absolutely convinced of the vital importance of archives and records as a social history as well as a documentation of practice. It re-energized and reconnected me professionally to my own profession. There was an opportunity here to share, to observe practice, as I said, to experience embodied practice myself, and to be part of an evolving development of education strategies in the mediation of artworks and the introduction of this new revised People Studio, which was of particular relevance to my research. One thing I suppose I didn't know then, that I know now, is I flew home on the 29th of February, which is leap year, which I think is kind of significant given the pandemic. I didn't know there was a pandemic on its way. So a lot of the plans that myself and Wendy had have not been possible. They've been put, I hope, temporarily on the shelf in relation to the fallout of the pandemic, in particular to the structure of her museum and indeed the lack of opportunities for travel. We had hoped to do a lot of staff exchanges immediately after this. So then when I started to do was look at, well, what can you do? What can you do in a pandemic? And I suppose Zoom opened up a whole new opportunity to re-engage with her, again, by invitation. I was folded back into Flame, which is an organisation of our museum art education directors. And we had monthly meetings throughout the first couple of lockdowns, really throughout the whole of 2020. And that group are working in a really exciting project now where they're gathering evidence to look at and write about the potential of art museums and education into the future. It also, the Zoom facilitated me to Zoom back in and meet people virtually and connect my own team into that. But also, I think ironically, if that's a word, in IMA, the pandemic opened up a whole new possibility because, as many of you who visited IMA know, we are on a 48-acre open air site. And when all of the galleries were closed and we couldn't couldn't create any sort of indoor education events, we looked to the outdoors. So throughout 2020 and again in 2021, a major part of the museum's budget went into developing a multifaceted, interwoven program called IMA Outdoors. So I was able to, I had shared my experience of the People's Studio with my colleagues. So we tested out that notion of a People's Pavilion by erecting these outdoor open air tents throughout both summers. And we developed programs with a whole range of cultural organizations, community organizations, and our own teams. I've also then been starting to look at next year's work, which is the exploration of how we can actually start to digitize our records and our collection, and in order to actually work towards the development of the big idea that I have, which is creating access to the narratives and stories and context which IMA has created in its 30-year experience. So I think to wrap up, what I'd like to say is that there are a number of important things here for me to stress. The importance of peer-to-peer networking, which, as I said at the outset, Engage has continually created for me. The importance to have critical friends and the opportunity to work really closely with Wendy Woon that period and meet her on a weekly basis was just invaluable, and I think reciprocal. The opportunity that the Fulbright programme gave me, it has always been an inspiration to me with its inherent ethos of supporting international cultural exchange and personal and professional development. And then my time in New York, I just had such a good time. And, it fed my thinking in the broadest way, as well as fed my thinking in relation to my profession and museum education. And I think with all of this international work, I strive to embed what is relevant and timely into the day-to-day work back in the museum. And I've covered how I've tried to address that. So I'm hoping that I can leave you with a thought, which was a call to action at a really exciting event in 2019 in MoMA, where Wendy created an international event whereby people were in MoMA speaking to an assembled audience, but simultaneously there was a Twitter feed asking people to address the question of, under the generic heading, Art as a Radical Act. She asked people, is art education worth fighting for? I'd like to leave you with that, and maybe we can use that as a prompt to start talking. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was great. Hurrah. People are clapping silently, I think. I'll let you take your breath. We're just going to have a sort of little bit of a chat, really. As you were talking, and we've spoken several times, but I just wanted to ask you, am I correct in saying that the People's Studio was separate from MoMA rather than central within the gallery?
It's interesting you asked that, because it actually was central in the gallery. So physically, if anybody's been to MoMA, it's flanked by 53rd and 54th Street. So the foyer, you can enter into the main foyer from either of those streets. And what had been, and I find this really interesting, it's a little bit like Banksy's, exit from the bookshop or the gift shop. It had formerly been a bookshop, the space. So it overlooked the main atrium, so that when you came in, you could look up and see it. And, everybody had to enter the galleries from the floor that it was on. So it had a very pivotal physical space there across, as I say, overlooking the atrium and between what where there were a couple of galleries, but primarily the education space and the whole new wing that had been extended.
Okay, and about the sort of, what was the ambience like? It looked very quiet and studious in the images, and I just wondered, being in that space, you know, how people felt actually, you know, the public actually going into that space, and how did that work? As we all know, there are many publics, so it very much depended on who was there and why they were there. So there was everything from the really kind of hesitant person who was going to explore every nook and cranny of a museum, you know, and then wandered in and as quickly wandered back out again, to a man who, and I thought this was just a very touching story, and again, not knowing a pandemic was coming, a man who had planned to visit Paris. And I think he was in his late 70s, and for medical reasons couldn't travel. So he decided he was going to come into the lab every single day to make artwork. So he was there every day and spent a number of hours. But in between all of that, there was everybody from the ambient groups that, you know, arrived. Like I remember, you know, depending on what was happening in the city, because, you know, like a lot of major institutions, they have a huge tourist it's a real kind of measure of tourist kind of business in New York. So they would have had a lot of tourists who were ticking it off the box. You know, they had arrived in because they were going to see it, because of mainly to try and get up and see the sunflowers, the Van Gogh sunflowers, and then get back. So there was a huge tourist cohort. But then were people who came and found themselves there and stayed. And I thought this was really interesting, because if they had come to see all of those kind of signature artworks, they were really, really happy to spend time there. And the facilitators, all of the prompts were ways of kind of connecting people to what was in the galleries. Like they had the collective weaving, which was connected into a beautifully curated show called Taking a Thread for a Walk, which looked right back to Annie Albers, right through to contemporary artists' practice using fibre and thread. So there was ways to connect in and out. So the facilitators, who I have to say, without exception, were really skilled, used those sort of opportunities to prompt people to go and look at something in the galleries and maybe come back. You may have seen on that last slide of the display case, they had these little cards that connected the prompts to works that you could go and see in the galleries. So a lot of it was about creating that sort of circulation of looking at and responding to what was in the galleries. But I think importantly, and this is not unlike what I would have witnessed in Tate Exchange, it was very premised on interpersonal dialogue, very premised, like your fourth floor in Tate, on creating space that people could ask those odd questions. So the conversations were really interesting. And of course, because I had the luxury of being there, and they were also captured by more formally by evaluation, the conversations range from, how would I do this? You know, how do I weave? Right through to, you know, how did you get your job? You know, talking to the facilitators, to really, depending on what was happening. And this was Trump time, you know, and we were just around the corner from the Trump Tower. You know, oh gosh, yet again, Trump has done this or Trump has done that, and the fear that was in New York around that time. So it was a fantastic space for conversation. And then, so what happened was there was that kind of, I suppose, more ambient group and groups that came in and out. And then because of the program that was structured around it, there were moments where you could really go into a deep dive. So taking that concept of mapping, there was a number of really interesting workshops where there was artists collective based in Brooklyn, where they collect artist maps. Everything from the thing you might scratch in the back of a post-it to find your way somewhere, to more elaborate maps. So they shared their practice and in turn created workshops out of that. There was another connecting into weaving. There was a practitioner from South America who invited everybody to, you know, take an image of something that was important to them, and then she turned that into the template for a woven piece using a computer digital. As you can see, I know nothing about this app. So there were lots of moments where there were opportunities to spend time with artists and artist practice. And then the space more generally
the education team brought a lot of what would have been hidden in the other wing right into the centre. So they had teenage nights, they had music nights, they had poetry readings, they had conservationists from the conservation team talking about conserving works that had gone on view after the 2 years being reopened. And then there was a big emphasis at the same time in MoMA on performance art. So Popel, for example, was a show dedicated to him, and there was 2 or 3 times a day there were performances. So they were happening in the atrium. So of course then that unlocked other conversations. So it became very much a very open, public, dynamic education space.
And did the curatorial team get involved in any of that? So was it just the sort of, you know, the not just only
yeah
gallery agents? How did it affect the rest of the staffing and the rest of the organisation, in your opinion? In
my opinion, I think like all of our museums, you'll get curators who are committed to the public, and they will, you know, be hugely supportive. Like, it wasn't for the want of trying. Like Wendy did a lot, like they had a 2-year closure period. So she did a lot of preparatory work during that period, not just with her own teams, but with trustees, because everything has to be passed through trustees in MoMA structure, but also with fellow curators across the teams. And there were, you know, she had champions across the curatorial departments, and they were present, they were there, you know, and they were there sometimes because they were invited to give a public talk, but they were also there because they were curious about what was happening. So I'd say, yeah.
Thank you, that's great. I'm just looking at the chat in terms of questions that people have.
Yeah, so Lindsay, looks like
yeah. Fran yeah,
has a question, and Fran might like to ask the question. If Fran,
Fran, if you could ask, there are a few questions in there, Fran. So fire away if you can. Don't forget to unmute yourself if you're muted. Where is Fran?
Sorry, hang on one second.
Oh, there you are.
I'm doing that wonderful thing that we always do, juggling children and work.
Oh, no, hopefully not juggling children, absolutely.
I'd like to. Yeah, it's I was just interested, Helen, in your experiences of handling the archival material and thinking about your responses to that archive material, and thinking about how that archive material can convene dialogue and discussion in an online space. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about what kind of online spaces we need to create in order to create dialogue around these archives. And because it's problematic, isn't it, when you digitized material, it doesn't often give you it kind of sort of reduces that material to a digital file, and you're not necessarily, because I'm doing research in archives myself, and I know what it is to come across something that is pertinent and relevant in that moment. And so there's a lot of questions in there, and I'm really sorry. But it's just kind of having sat with archive material, how do you feel that we could be exploring this in sort of online with each other?
I wish I had the one, you know, incredible answer, and you'd all go away and say, "Woo, eureka moment." But what I relate to when you say that is, I just found, well, first of all, I found the smell of the materials really overpowering and overwhelming sometimes. You know, didn't expect that. But handling the fragility of paper, you know, seeing the notes in the margins, really finding things, I suppose, that are almost accidental, you know, and just, I suppose I was also really interested in how we record, you know, because I've been around long enough to remember all the different versions of videotape, you know, and we're constantly kind of digitizing and upgrading things. So I would have I feel very strongly about the actual physical materials being retained, and that's a bit of an argument I'm having, like healthily in my own museum, because there's that argument around space and documentation and keeping things and not keeping things, and of course everybody would love, those proponents of digitizing everything want everything digitized. So there's a kind of a space aspect, as in recording and storage space aspect. But I think for us who work in the field, just to see, like with just see how physically how people, like in this case, how D'Amico and all of his peers working there even physically made things. Like he had these beautiful maquettes of like of exhibitions that became touring exhibitions. So it was everything from really fragile paper to really clunky bits of kind of wood, which things have been, I suppose, heat mounted onto. So how I think, I don't know how you could replace that with the digital, because I don't think it's replaceable. But I suppose it's deciding what is it about the digital that gives us, what are the pluses and the minuses, I suppose, of digital. But I don't have the actual answer. I'm struggling with it, as you can hear, even in my answer now. So maybe it is something that I certainly be really delighted to talk to you about in more detail and try and problem solve with you.
I mean, absolutely. And I'm still struggling with it. And I don't think that there is an answer, but I think it's useful to have those conversations as well.
And I suppose it's, one thing that, which was really exciting for me, and I possibly didn't give her enough credit, but Dr. Sarah Torres had done her PhD looking at, you probably have you come across it? Yeah. Just the fact that education archives are not considered priority, and that really worries me, because, even how they're talked about generally, they're generally in the same way. I suppose sometimes, Lindsay, come back to what you and I were talking about in the preparation for this, sometimes as subservient to the curatorial practice, whereas, what I really felt was what I was reading about was a whole movement. It wasn't just what happened in an art studio somewhere in, downtown in New York. It was about a whole movement of people who came together at a particular time, and look at what they went on to do, like Black Mountain College, etc. So it's giving credence and relevance to how what might seem like a very kind of small drop in the ocean, how that then ripples right out, and we won't know that unless we capture and hold on to these documents.
I know, and with I don't want to dominate the conversation. It's kind of, but were you aware that there were huge gaps in the archive at Mont with Victor I can't pronounce his name.
Victor D'Amico. I know it took me a while. I gave you 3 months in New York. There, I suppose it was it's a very personal archive. It's it's quite D'Amico-centric, which I thought was interesting. He was very much centre and at front to everything that was done in that first 30 years. I just don't know how the man had the energy to do everything he did. Maybe he wasn't juggling children around, but so that's something that Sarah had done a lot of thinking about, which was great, where, essentially archives are very personal, and they're personal to the time and the place and the people who have gathered those records around them.
But I'll kind of finish. Oh, sorry, Lindsay.
I was just going to say, it begs the question about how we all archive our work. What we archive, who's making the decisions about what are the protocols around archiving our work? What type of archival material in terms of the format will we need in the future, hence digitization, etc., etc. Because at Tate, we had to have paper records as well as digital records. But, everybody was tasked with doing their own archiving on a set of protocols. But finding the time to do that, it's like flying a plane while you're making it. Is that right? Yeah, something like that. But you know what I mean? And it's a constant process that we should be embedding into our practice. But it just begs that question. I might look at a file and go, I don't think that's important, but it might be to somebody else. So it's kind of thinking, what are the future researchers how can we imagine what future researchers would want to do?
Mm.
And
I don't think we can.
Patchy. Yeah, our practice is patchy in terms of archiving, just because, you know, sometimes there's only one person, there may be freelance, you know, and it's a tricky question, and it's a big question.
Yeah.
But in terms of our profession, thinking how can we best do that in going forward.
Mm.
Anything else, Fran? Sorry.
I was only going to add one more layer of complexity to that, in that each time somebody visits an archive, they bring their own questions and kind of interests to that archive. So over time, how material that you deposit now will be read in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. It's kind of like the interests of the archive user changes over time too, and how do you track that? And so it's kind of, because that in itself is really interesting.
Yeah, and
I'll put myself on mute now.
Sorry, Fran, did I cut in on you too early?
No.
Well, I think, you see, if we think of archives as living rather than fossilized, I think the rereading of that archive is really important. And, you know, Sarah Torres did a lot of work after the Victor D'Amico. She saw gaps in, you know, in the archives. Like this is the first 30 years. So she started to interview Philip Enuan, who had been a previous director of education. So I think there's always that way of revisiting an archive from the present and particularly I think oral histories are really important. Of course, again, it will be the telling of a tale rather than maybe a more scientific data collection, but I think it's all relevant. You know, this is about interpersonal exchange and possibilities for gathering.
Thank you, Fran, for your complex. I don't think I can see any more actual questions.
No, there's a comment from Victoria about a resource that's been created called the Coventry Atlas, which is fabulous. Coventry University and City of Culture Initiative. But then colleagues might have more questions. Otherwise, Sarah's got one.
Yep.
Hi, yes, I put my hand up. I wasn't sure which way to throw into the room. Helen, I absolutely love your talk, and it's so inspiring. I went to the US for a month, and what you talk about coming back with the can-do attitude, it just made such a difference to how I was thinking about my own job, and it cracked open what I thought my job could be. I'd put all these restrictions around what I could and couldn't do, and then you see this really exciting practice, which is like, well, why not? You know, why not? You know, and that's what I sort of took home. And then, of course, you know, the walls come back. So I'm just sort of, my question is around how you kind of hold that energy and keep it and feed it into the team.
Yeah, and that was the real challenge, Sarah, because I had really, you know, I had this vision between, you know, the Fulbright support and my own museum that we would be having physical exchanges for staff, because, you know, telling the tale is one thing. It's like coming home with all the great stories after a 2-week holiday in the sun. But it was just to find, you know, while I was there, I could see, gosh, this person could, you know, work really well with, you know, somebody on my team and back and forth. So, you know, it's quite a lot of, like, I haven't talked about it yet, but like you know, between the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter rippling effect across the US, MoMA was a casualty in terms of staffing in relation to the fallout of all of that. So Wendy Woon had to take an early retirement. A lot of the senior team left. You know, there was a lot. They let go all of their part-timers, and all of the facilitators in the creativity lab were long-term part-timers. So there's, you know, what I'm trying to do is not look at all of the like tragedy of all of that, which it is. It's just, and you know, I realise how fortunate I have been in a publicly funded institution in Ireland, where quite the opposite happened during the pandemic. We were supported to stay in our jobs. So what I feel is that, you know, I tap into what I was able to tap into then in terms of, as you say, that can do, the resilience, and really believing that this is important. You know, I find myself really rethinking what is the function of our museum in this period of pandemic. You know, areas of programming that I would have thought perhaps should have happened somewhere elsewhere, we have folded it into our programming. An example of that would be we ran yoga throughout the 2 summers. We have a fantastic facilitator on one of our visitor engagement teams who is a trained yoga practitioner. Prior to the pandemic, I wouldn't have thought that, you know, I would have thought that yoga was something that some galleries are doing kind of on the side, whereas really bringing people right into, you know, the sanctuary of a space that a museum can offer seemed really vital now. And we have a programme in IMA which links to one of our local hospitals, which in itself has a creativity programme. And we have a social prescription programme, which again, during the pandemic, we would have struggled to get people to come from the hospital to us, but they came, you know, in much bigger numbers during the period because we offered, again, an outdoor safe space. So I started really rethinking the programme, and it was great because our collections team have also, under the stewardship of our director, been rethinking the collections. So we've been able to really rethink what is vital. So I think that's what I held on to, Sarah. What's vital in my job? It has changed utterly. I didn't think, you know, came from Manhattan and then I'm in a box room this one year, you know. Everything shifted so hugely. But I think what has been really important is what I tapped into when I was in New York was why I've done what I've done all my working life and why I want to continue to be an advocate for this into the future. And I also realised there's no one way. It's a constantly changing, evolving way of being, way of working. And I just believe the arts can contribute in some way to, you know, the real major challenges that we're all trying to cope with now.
Thanks so much. It's yes. Sorry, time for somebody else to ask something.
Thank you, Sarah and Helen. We've got a little bit of time left, but I was also sort of trying to kind of pick up on what you've just said about the world has changed, and we have to change with it. And that means whole organisational approach to change. And as Engage is going through change, and I think a lot of organisations are doing that, and some are having to naturally downsize and become much more focused about, as you say, Helen, what matters. You know, why do we do this? Why do, you know, what are galleries there for? Museums, who are they for, more importantly? And really kind of focus on the things that actually achieve those aims. And I think it's important also to include those people we work with. I think the partners, the communities and the relationships that are strong, but maybe relationships that need strengthening going forward, and really kind of valuing. I feel there's an opportunity for a re-evaluation of the core of what we do. I don't know how you feel, Helen.
No, I couldn't agree more. You know, so it's a very reflective period for me because, you know, I've been 30 years at this institution, the Irish Museum of Modern Art. You know, we have at the moment our 4th artistic director. What's fantastic for me is that there's a lot of mirroring of the founding directors' ideologies and principles. So, you know, the museum she sees the museum as a civic space, and she sees art as being part of every day and being part of the radical way we see ourselves. So I think throughout my whole career, I think it has always been about adapting, never losing my core principles, but trying to adapt to the things that are changing around me. And I hope not in a sort of an inflexible way, but in a way that sees the opportunity and sees the opportunity at different times. And I suppose the thing that I found really exciting and kind of taps into Fran's question and yours, Sarah, looking back at these archives, which were, 80 years ago, this man was doing this work, and realizing, everywhere around the world there's individuals with these great ideas, and I had all those great naive ideas you have as a young person coming out of art college, but seeing that other people across the globe literally have these ideas also, I felt really renewed by that. And I think that one thing that we were talking about, Lindsay, yesterday in preparation, what's so fantastic about the museum or gallery space is that it's a very open space. So I think to allow that openness to give us as permission, I suppose, to test things out, and sometimes to get it wrong, other times to find maybe a couple of years later you reflect back and say, that was actually the right thing to do. But really to be open. And I suppose the other thing too is to lean in to your colleagues and friends across the world, because I couldn't have done all of this work that I do or believe the way I do without being able to lean in and share those sometimes more low moments or worried moments or insecure moments around my practice, as well as sharing the possibilities and the excitement and potential of success if we join together.
That's very inspiring, actually. And also, kind of feeds in I suppose directly, Jane, to where this professional group of people that you have connections with through Engage and Engage's partners, and each museum or gallery's partners is something that, we need to kind of keep focusing on that sharing of practice and supporting one another and seeing and sharing ideas, really.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that is really, really surfaced through the process of working with trustees, members and the team on a theory of change, that kind of the necessity to support the sharing of practice so that we can create really cutting edge practice, actually. That's and I think one thing that I really picked up from the conversations we've had over the last few weeks, Helen, is how important a peer group has been for you throughout your career, but also how important a peer group is in terms of that being country bound, but broader than that as well. That seems absolutely critical as well.
And finding that we have to feed ourselves as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I can see, Lindsay, there's a lovely observation from Amanda in the chat. I don't know if Amanda's still here. It's really sort of about, she says as an observation that we're bringing together, that you've been bringing together through this discussion, art dialogic ideas. But Amanda, do you want to say a bit more?
That'd be great. Hi, Amanda.
Hello, struggling with the technology. You think by now I'd have it cracked, wouldn't you? But oh well. No, I was very exciting to hear Helen speak and then just follow the conversation. And I don't think it's anything new, but I really liked the sense that there were these combination of dialogic spaces which are not, necessarily resolved, where we're kind of contesting ideas and processes and practices, and that I just felt that's the work that we're doing. But it just basically, I just had a moment, so I'm not really saying anything that is not already in the room.
Yeah, no, you are, Amanda, though. Thank you so much, because it is, that really is. I love that sort of sense that to be dialogical or to have dialogue with people can be as valid being non-verbal as it is to have a really deep, complex conversation. And that's what I really love, such gift to be able to observe people working silently, perhaps not saying anything to anybody for a few hours, or people, really exchanging words. and that being intergenerational, I thought that was really. I remember a whole family who had come in. They had these free Fridays and Friday night, so the family were obviously on their free ticket. And a little boy discovered the weaving loom, which was really, in essence, simple, but he was so fascinated by it. And he was with a couple of aunts and I'd say cousins, and they waited until he was finished. And the respect that I saw there was so beautiful, and I thought that really was a dialogue there. And the other thing that I didn't talk about when Lindsay asked me on my reflections was, again, it's an anecdote, but I was on the subway one day and there was a big recycling campaign, which they certainly needed in New York. And there was a poster on the subway, which, and I'm paraphrasing what it said, in real cool language. Oh, do you keep your children's art? Oh, throw it out, recycle it, they'll forgive you. And I just thought it's just with like a cold hand wrapped around my heart, that there was just that little respect publicly best of the value of people making marks and, making a decision about what they do with those marks they make, whether it's a weaving or a big narrative piece or something tentative. And that's what I thought was happening and that I witnessed was the restoration of valuing the multiple ways that we communicate and make sense of the world. And
also that's that kind of social history, family archiving, isn't it? I mean,
yes,
I'll keep everything, but
yeah,
It's kind of it's a sort of moment in time and special to people and children. Well, I want to thank everyone. I think it's probably about time to wrap up, isn't it, Jane? I can't see any more questions in the chat.
No, just lots of thank yous, Helen.
Lots of thank yous. Yes,
thank you.
And everyone's absolutely energized by what you've been saying. Lots and lots of food for thought there about how we move forward and what might change, what we might focus on, etc. And there'll be more opportunities through Engage to share practice maybe on some of these themes going forward. So I'd like to thank Helen especially, but also I'd like to thank all of our members, the people I know and the people I don't know. I thank you all, and hand back over to Jane.
Yeah, so
I am, aren't I? Yes.
Yeah, for a few more thank yous, of course. So I just really want to thank Lindsay for chairing, Helen for preparation, but also for you've given me some wonderful moments over the last few weeks discussing this extraordinary range of topics. Thanks for all the observations and questions. But Helen, I'm just so impressed that you really have taken us on the journey where we thought about Black Mountain, about Dewey, then we were thinking about modernism, we were thinking about really important researchers and writers at the moment like Emily Pringle, but then you thought so hard about how that related to practice, your practice, and also your profession. So thank you, that was absolutely wonderful. And very inspiring, fabulous. Thank you so much. And so I just want to thank everyone for taking part today. Thank you for coming to this lecture, but also to the AGM. And I just wanted to do a huge thank you to the team, not just for supporting today's event, but actually over the last year for being fabulous colleagues. So thank you for the team and to the board. And that's it, actually. We will, as Lindsay suggested, Helen has very generously said that we'll find a way to share more of what she's been working on with all of you, it's exciting.
So I suppose, is that an invitation to members to maybe put some ideas forward about what they'd like to hear more of?
Well, members are always welcome to do that. Yes, yeah,
that would be great.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. That'd be cool. And actually, thank you, Lindsay. We're about to we'll send out the members survey in January. Fabulous. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. And thanks, Loveday, for earlier and Janie.
Okay, bye.
Bye.